Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. We're very excited you've joined us. Our topic is a very important one. It's about getting your web apps ready for the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA. Today's webinar is sponsored by ShiftLeft. My name is Mitch Ashley, and I'll serve as your host and moderator. A few housekeeping items before we start. The webinar is being recorded, and we will send an email with a link to the recording. Following the webinar, it also will be available on DevOps.com. We're also giving away 3 Amazon gift card certificates at the end of our webinar, so stick around to the end and find out if you're one of our 3 winners. Last but not least, our speaker loves questions. We love to interact with our audience, hear what you're thinking, and try to help you by answering questions. So please pop those into the questions tab of the GoToWebinar software. So let's move on to our topic. Getting your web apps ready for the California Consumer Privacy Act. It's my great pleasure to introduce you today's speaker, Arun Balakrishnan, who is Director of Product Management at ShiftLeft. Arun, love for you to take it away.
Thank you, Mitch, and thank you for having us for this webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar today. And as Mitch mentioned, the topic for the webinar today is getting your web apps ready for the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. The CCPA goes into effect in 82 days. Right? 82 days from today is when the act goes into effect. It was signed into law on June 28th last year. And as I mentioned, it's Jan 1st of 2020 when it goes into effect. The law grants consumers multiple rights. I've listed some of them on the screen. So rights for disclosure on what information is maintained on a particular customer, having the right to access that data, having the right to opt out of that data being collected on them. One key differentiator for the CCPA is the right of equal service. This means if a consumer were to opt out of being collected, the data being collected, that doesn't mean that consumer gets a different or a lower quality of service, and also ability to have that data erased. So at this point, Mitch, if you could throw out that poll for the audience, please.
Okay, there we go.
Perfect, thank you. So the poll just asks you a single question, just to know where you are today with your readiness for the CCPA. I'll give maybe 20 seconds for the audience to respond, just to get an idea of where the audience is coming from. We'll see the results, and then we'll go ahead with the presentation. So 10 more seconds.
Just imagine we have our Jeopardy countdown music. Should you like me to go ahead and close the poll?
Yes, please.
Okay, great.
Okay. Okay, so Mitch, I cannot see.
Okay. Yeah, let's
okay, yeah, I have it expanded now. Perfect. Okay, so I have the results. So, okay, so 33% of the audience say we haven't started yet. Yet another 33% says we are researching solutions. 29% say we have started implementing something, and 5% say we are already compliant. Okay, so that is, so of the group, it's 94%, 95% are not compliant yet, and 66% haven't started implementing anything. Okay, so that is pretty consistent with what we have seen among our customers as well. The fact that this law has been known for over a year now, and with 80 odd days to go. Yeah, it's time to act. That's the consensus. And even if you are not applicable for this law, an overall take on data breach, the quote on the bottom, especially when it comes to small and medium businesses. Having a data breach is very bad. It's, as the quote says, that 60% of these businesses go out of business in around 6 months after a breach. So that is bad. Now, one disclaimer before we go into the presentation. This is not a legal presentation, so we are not legal experts here at ShiftLeft. We are not here to dissect and look at each clauses of the act, saying this is what it means, this is what it doesn't mean. What we are here to do is look at it from a technical perspective, right? So we are a technology provider, and from our perspective, what does it mean to be compliant, especially for your web applications? So these are applications that are facing your customers. What are the steps to take? How do you go about doing it? What are the options that you have today in order to get compliant? And so that is what we will be looking at. Now, the first question to ask of yourself is, does CCPA apply to my organization? Do I need to be compliant? The criteria for CCPA is pretty broad. The first one is pretty obvious, is do I handle any data of California residents? Right? It says handle, so it could be you're collecting it, you're processing it, you're selling it, whatever those could be. So that is the first criteria. And the second, as you can see, it is or, so it's one of those three, is based on your gross revenue for a year, or it also is how much data are you handling. So are you doing more than 50,000 records, 50,000 information of either residents or households or devices? And or you're making more than 50% of your revenue from selling this information. Right? So as you can see, it is pretty broad. But if you don't fit into these, you don't need to be compliant for CCPA, at least in the beginning. But when you cross any of these limits, you need to start being compliant. Now, CCPA, what does it mean if you're not compliant? Well, the violation penalties are pretty high. At a consumer level, the private right of action damages, businesses are liable to pay a minimum of $100, a maximum of $750 per customer per incident. Now, multiply that by the number of customers you have, those numbers could suddenly be huge. And that is from a customer perspective. Now, from a regulator aspect, there is yet another fee to it, and that's a minimum of $7,500 per violation. And notice there is no maximum ceiling mentioned there. Right? So the violation penalties are pretty high. And it doesn't stop with the CCPA. The CCPA is one bill that is top of mind for a lot of businesses today. But other states are doing something similar. So there's a bunch of states across the US who have similar bills, either in the process, close to being passed. Some of them even have dates of when they will go into effect. So CCPA is just the first one in the US, but there's a bunch following it. This all started with GDPR last year. So that is mid last year in 2018. CCPA, as I mentioned, goes into effect in less than 3 months from now. 6 months following that, there's 4 states where it's set to be in effect soon. 4 states follow that 6 months after that, and the rest follow. What our customers today here at ShiftLeft are trying to do is trying to adopt a technique which would work for all of these, right? So versus having to go back and redo something, what they're trying to do is, okay, let's put something in place. Let's do a set of assessment techniques which would make me compliant, but which would work on an ongoing basis, so that when the new thing comes in, it might be a matter of just generating a different report, but I don't have to go back to the drawing board and rethinking my strategy and putting a different solution in place. Now, we've seen what CCPA is at a high level. We've seen who are eligible or who it applies to. And we've also seen some of the acts that are going to follow. Let's look at what CCPA involves. Compliance with CCPA, there's multiple steps involved. So the Act clearly lays out 5 steps, starting with data inventory, then the individual rights that we looked at, enabling customers to have that option. And also, as part of this process, if you have figured out any security gaps or vulnerabilities in your applications, putting remediations in place. And one thing CCPA requires is also to show that the remediations that you have put in place actually work. Right? So starting off with data inventory and mapping, what this means is finding out where all your collecting and processing data that falls under the scope of the CCPA. The 2, 3, and 4 normally involves putting in options on, say, your website or having a process in place where customers can avail of those rights. And 4 is also when you work with third-party vendors, updating your SLAs with them, because if they are not compliant, then you're not going to be compliant, and that the onus is on you to be compliant for your organization. And then step 5, as I mentioned, is remediating the gaps that you identify. So let's go by these steps one after the other. So the main important step, at least in our purview for web applications, is number 1. Now, what does number 1 involve? So on the left, the diagram that you see is a data flow diagram. This is common representation in engineering teams. What this represents is the flow of data in your applications. So there's a source of information that is coming in. There are a bunch of processes that might manipulate, transform, process the data. And that processed output ends up going into a sink or some kind of storage. Now, as part of step 1 of the CCPA is to identify all these routes. Now, not just identify all the routes, because data just doesn't flow from a source to a sink. You also need to identify all the transformations that go through, so that you can then identify, okay, this data went through this transformation, it is then passing on to this another process, so you can clearly identify all the flows. But the other step, that's step 5 in CCPA, is to identify the gaps and remediations. So the identifying the transformations is important for that too. Let's see an example of this in action, and that will make this much clearer. So let's take the example of an organization. It has a bunch of web and mobile applications. So the first step is to identify all those applications, the applications that are actually consumer facing. Once you have done that, is to identify the data that you actually collect from a customer. So the example here I've mentioned, okay, you collect name, social, address, and then you might have a bunch of transactions on top of it. So this is the data that you have. Now, the next step in your process is to identify your assets, your inventory of your things in the environment. And this could be a bunch of things. So the primary suspects are, okay, where does this information reside at the end of the day? So that's your databases and storage mechanisms. You might allow, or you might pull in data from other services, or you might even allow this data to be accessed by a third-party services. So that's where API access comes into picture, and also the integrations that you do with other third-party SaaS services. And one often overlooked element, which in the recent past has led to a lot of data breaches, is this information flowing into logs. So log aggregators are a very important sink as well. And logging is used extensively for debugging purposes, for analytics, for performance improvement. But this is a common area where sensitive information could leak into. And so that is something you need to identify. So now we've identified the consumer-facing applications. We've identified the data models. We've identified where your sinks are. Next is to identify the information flows that happen. Right. So this is to say, okay, I'm collecting all this information. This is where this information ends up flowing into. Now, once you've identified this, is also to identify any architectural constraints that you have put in place. So for instance, if I'm collecting SSN and I'm writing it into my data store, I need to encrypt that information before it goes into rest. Right? Now, that is the architectural constraint you would put in place to ensure that you are compliant. But this is also the step where you identify the gaps. So for instance, if you've identified that, okay, I've got PII data that flows into a log file, and I use that for analytics, I don't need that exact information in the log file. I could redact it, I could mask it, I could do a bunch of controls, which would make me compliant, but would also make my analytics not break. Right? So by masking it, so there are tools out there who might replace names with similar sounding names, replace age with similar demographics. So your analytics and your marketing campaigns and all of that would still work, but you are not storing the actual PII data, so you are still compliant. And could be where you're allowing access over APIs, or you're pulling in data. So again, obfuscating, encrypting data before it flows through all these channels. So this is the step 5 in that 5-step process is if you identify that any of these areas have a gap, this is where you would put that new control in place. But remember, I mentioned as part of the CCPA, you also need to prove that these redactions and these encryptions and these controls are actually in the path. So you need a way to have an automated assessment as well. So for this flow, if you run through a use case where, okay, you went into the new user creation form, the user enters an SSN, it flows into the log file, and then there is a redaction method in front of it. And you need to have a way to continuously assess this so that whenever, say, the engineering team goes and makes a change, or maybe there is a new flow for users to sign up, so there is a new form which also accepts SSN numbers, or maybe there is a new log aggregation method that you introduced, and so SSNs are now flowing into that log as well. You need to ensure that this redaction control is there in the path of all of these new methods. So that is the automated assessment capability. Now, let's see what kind of information CCPA puts controls over. So CCPA's definition of what constitutes as personal information is pretty broad. A lot of this you might have seen with other regulations, so like GDPR is an example where you see a bunch of these. But one important difference in CCPA is not just at the individual level, it is also at what they call as a household. So any kind of profiling, any kind of inferences you can make over an entire household based on information that you collect from individuals within that household. So that is also part of the CCPA's definition. And in the previous example that we saw of that entire flow, what we primarily saw was identifiers and information in customer records. Right? So that information, of course, is primary concern for CCPA. So now we've seen how you would go about doing an assessment, the current way or the steps that are required to do that assessment. And we just took a look at what kind of information you should be looking for. So in order to be CCPA compliant, you need a solution that is comprehensive. Now, looking at it from a web application perspective, you need a solution that works in the development phase. So you need a solution that works before you put that product out there, that's already accessible by customers, and customers are already submitting data. Right? You don't want to find if there is a leak once that application has gone live, because then it's tougher to remediate. It is trying to play catch up. You want to be proactive rather than reactive. And the second one is you want something that is automated. So you want it to ensure compliance for every change that you make. So the example that we looked at previously, imagine your engineering team is making some changes in your source code, in your application. It is starting to accept some more information, or there is another way of accessing the same information. All of these changes shouldn't mean that, okay, you go over this whole compliance process again. You are now identifying all those new methods. You are now ensuring that compliance is in place. The big reason for this is organizations today make changes to their web applications multiple times a day. That's the norm. Now, years back, when, say, you updated your applications once in 3 months, yes, the fact that, okay, you made the change, you have time to go in, identify the changes, ensure that you have controls in place, and then release the application was a possibility. And now that is literally impossible, where if something is not automated and something that doesn't work for every single release, well, then you are not compliant. You are already behind. And then the third one is organizations today, when we mention a web application, a lot of the application is not written in-house. Organizations use third-party dependencies, open source libraries, they write some code on top of it, and all of this together becomes a web application. Now, yes, the code that you write could be all compliant, but that doesn't mean that the code that you've inherited or you're adopting or using is compliant. So you need to have a way to ensure that your entire web application is compliant, because if a third-party dependency is not compliant, well, that means you are not compliant, and it is the onus is on you to ensure that you are. So whatever solution that you adopt should be able to work across this entire stack. And from a technology perspective, from a deployment usage perspective, this should easily integrate into your existing tooling and pipeline. So as I mentioned, organizations release multiple times a day. What they do to enable that is what's called CI/CD, continuous integration and continuous deployment. So organizations, when engineers make changes in the source code, it's automatically pulled, the product is built, it might go through a bunch of tests, and then it goes into deployment, and all of this is automated end to end. Now, if for compliance, it means breaking this pipeline, it means that, okay, you need to stop at some point, and then somebody needs to come in and do these analysis, and then the pipeline continues. That would end up breaking a lot of processes at organizations. And more importantly, it would lead to a lot of resistance in adoption. And if a compliant solution is not properly adopted, it means you are at risk and you could be non-compliant if you're not doing it for every release. So whatever solution you adopt should easily integrate into a CI/CD pipeline. But not just easily integrate, it should also be fast. Now, the reason for being fast is if you're releasing as I mentioned, 2 to 3 times a day, and you have these huge web applications, and if the compliant solution that you put into place, if it means that it's going to take hours or maybe even days to scan this application, to scan for the changes, see whether it is compliant, that again would break your pipeline. So if the solution that you integrate doesn't work in the same timelines that your current pipeline works, again, it is tough to adopt and there will be a lot of resistance. Let's look at some of the existing solutions in the market today, which could help with compliance, and let's see what the gaps are. So the first option is manual code reviews. Right? So this is the default that a lot of organizations start thinking about, is saying, okay, let me look at source code, let me start figuring out where is all the data coming in from, what happens to the data, where it flows into. This used to be possible when applications were smaller, and also when you had a lot more time on hand before the applications were released. Nowadays, releases and updates are so fast, this process is extremely difficult to do. And not just that, the modern applications, the modern web applications, they're pretty complex, and they have thousands of places where data could flow in from, where they flow into, all the transformations that go in between. A lot of these transformations would happen in third-party or open source libraries, and trying to manually identify all this is next to impossible. It is time-consuming, even if it's possible. It's very expensive. And the main important thing is this is not a scalable model. So when changes are happening at a rapid pace, you're always trying to catch up and keep in sync. And that means you're not compliant for most of these new releases. The second option is trying to then automate these analysis. So static code analysis, that's been in the market for 15 odd years. There's a bunch of tools out there. The issue there is they are trying to second guess as to what your application is doing. Right? So these tools can look at source code, but they do not understand the full logic of what's happening in your application. So when you don't understand business logic, one, you could miss a lot of what is happening. And equally worse is you find a lot of issues, but then you have to go in and say that, oh, but you didn't understand the context, and hence we are taking care of redacting or encrypting that information, and it is not an actual issue. Right? So the first one is missing issues as false negatives, and marking an issue as a real one when it is not, false positives. So both false negatives and false positives are a big issue with static code analysis tools. And it's limited visibility. So now legacy static analysis tools are painfully slow. Most of these tools take hours, if not days, to scan big code bases. And for that fact, they might only focus on the code that you have written. So they don't work across the stack, across all these third-party dependencies and libraries. So that then leaves you a lot of blind spots in your application where you don't know if all those pieces are compliant. And the fact that they take so long to complete, the point that I mentioned, the first manual code review and also in the previous slide, you cannot integrate the solution into a CI/CD pipeline because it would just break your pipeline. It would make it slow. It just doesn't work in a modern CI/CD DevOps process. And the third option could be saying, okay, shall I put something in front of the application and see if data is leaking? Well, one, that is too late because then you're now already in production. you don't know if it will leak, you're trying to second guess, you're trying to catch it in action. Missing something there is more dangerous than missing something before you put it out there. And there are also issues with the controls that you put. So the WAF and RASP kind of applications, the fact that they are in production and the fact that most of the web applications today are enabled for HTTPS encrypted traffic, the moment you put in a WAF, you now need to decrypt the traffic, you need to process it, you need to re-encrypt it. The more stricter, stronger encryption you use, the more additional work the WAF has to do now. So there's a lot more overhead, and it's expensive and slow, and it would directly impact the latency that your customers experience on your web applications. So the response they get would be slower. And this is only between the customer and your web applications. Now, a production level solution has no idea what is happening behind the application. So it could be leaking sensitive information into the database, into the log files. It could leak it over all the APIs and third-party integrations it has, because a WAF doesn't sit in those areas. And so those leaks all would continue to exist. So you are plugging one hole, but you're not plugging everything. And the WAF, of course, is operating off of traffic. So it is pattern matching. It doesn't know what the application is actually doing. So it is also similar to a SaaS tool. It is blind to business logic. And so it could easily miss out on things. So we've seen what is involved in doing a manual way of detecting the steps 1 and 5 in CCPA. We've seen as to what a solution would require to make this effective. We've seen 3 possibilities in the market today as to how it could happen, the limitations of these solutions. Let's quickly look at what ShiftLeft can offer. So we here at ShiftLeft have a unique approach to making these assessments. What we innovated is a method called CPG, that's Code Property Graph. We represent your source code in a single data structure called the CPG, and we can then analyze that graph representation to figure out where data is flowing from and where do they end up and all the transformations that they go through. And the fact that it's a single representation compared to other vendors who might do this as 6 or 7 disparate representations, we do it in a single way, which makes it more efficient, which makes it much faster, and which also makes it more accurate. And not just that, the fact that we can do it fast and accurate and in a comprehensive fashion, we can also do this across your entire stack. So the diagram on the left, which is representing what is the code that you write and the code that you adopt and inherit, we can cover the entire spectrum. So starting from your application logic, all the open source frameworks that you use, all the open source dependencies that you use, all the third-party SaaS APIs and SDKs that you integrate with, the dependencies of those APIs and SDKs. So we can analyze and give a representation of this entire stack, and we can see where the data is flowing across this entire layers of implementation. Now, an example of what we could do for CCPA is on the screen. So this is a sample report that we can generate. We start off with the sensitive data mapping. So that was step 1 in the CCPA, saying, okay, this is where, so in the example here is credit card number and some PII data is being collected from the user. We work at the source code, the application binary level. So we are not second guessing based on what the application is acting in real life. We are looking at how the application is created. So we identify where that sensitive element is. inside the application. And then looking at all the transformations and where the data is flowing to, we can identify all the leaks that happen in the data in the application. So that's that second image on data leaks. We say, okay, this information is now then leaking into these areas. So network, into logs. Okay, we don't see any leaks happening into files. We see this leaking over an email service. And if you can see there, we pinpoint the line of code and which source code file this leak is happening. All right, so this then goes into step 5 on CCPA, is identifying the gaps and remediating them. So if it is an actual leak, you go to that source code line number, and then you figure out what change you need to make there to stop the leak. But if that information is going there for, as I mentioned, marketing campaigns or analytics, well, then you can't just stop the information from leaking. You need to put a control in place. And that's that third screen there called protection measures. So you can then put in a redaction or a protection or maybe a sanitization method. You put those controls in place. Now we can detect those two. And that is also part of the report. And so this goes back to the point of me saying, you need to prove that these redaction or these controls actually work. And so that's where this protection measures report would come into picture, where we say, okay, this is the sensitive data. This was the leak. Okay, that leak is not there anymore, but now there is a new protection measure in place. This is where the protection method is. And yes, it is active. Now, let's see an example of where this would imply. So imagine you had the credit card number being collected, and it was leaking over the network, and the log file, see there are 3 lines there. Now, you put a protection method in place. And so those 3 lines of leaks through a log file would go away from the report. Now, imagine the application changes over time, and there is another place in the source code where this credit card information was written into a log file. Now, immediately the next analysis, that new line would appear in the report, wherein it will say, okay, there's a new method that is now leaking. And it is present in this report because the redaction or the control that you put in doesn't cover this new leak. So that helps you now go back and figure out, do I move the control upstream? Do I put a new control? Do I move the control downstream? So you make those decisions. And once you make the fix, you come back, reanalyze, and you can check if the control is working, whether the leak went away, whether the control is acting. So this is a continuous ongoing process that you would need to enable, and our analysis and reporting helps you achieve that. One of the points I mentioned in what would be an ideal solution is the fact that it should be easily integratable and it should be fast. Our claim to fame is that we can analyze up to 1 million lines of code in less than 15 minutes versus other claims of other vendors where it could go into hours or days. So off the bat, we are 30 to 40 times faster. I mentioned we do it as a single representation. So I mentioned we are more accurate. If you go to our website, you can see reports of us having analyzed us against OWASP benchmarks, where we are 2 to 3 times more accurate than closest competition. But one thing that we also enable is all of what you saw as reporting is also accessible over APIs. So it's very easy for you to integrate this into any tooling that you have today. So it could be integrating into GitHub like repositories, Jenkins like build systems. It is very easy for you to put this in place. And now that you have all the data over a JSON file, it is not just PDF reports, but these are very actionable. You could pull this information and then pipe it off into any webhooks that you have. You could notify, you could even fail a build if you want to, saying whatever code change was made is now violating some policies. So you could act on the analysis in a bunch of ways. We were presenting this capability to one of our customers recently. So the quote on the bottom, it's a major multinational financial services organization. And their response was, this is exactly what they were looking for to ensure that their web applications are compliant with the CCPA. And it's not just us claiming, it's not me putting quotes from customers. Last week, we were also awarded the Data Leak Detection Solution of the Year by Cybersecurity Breakthrough Awards of 2019. To give you perspective, there were 3,500 odd applicants for this award. And so we won the award from that application pool. So it's also the industry or these award committees saying that, yeah, we are capable of detecting these data leaks. Now, one offer I would like to put up before we end the webinar. So as part of this webinar, we are offering a free assessment for all the attendees. This is the free assessment tier helps you get a single report on a single application, Java-based, where you can create a report like what you saw on the previous screens, which would tell you, give you an assessment of what your applications are, where the data is, the data flow, is it leaking somewhere, do you have any controls in place? So we can do that. We are also offering a compliance package, which would get you through January 15th. So that is when 2 weeks post the effective date for CCPA. This would be white glove where we can do a lot of onboarding and analysis help with the team we have. And that price is per application, and we then can also do for more applications, more programming languages. And it also gives you unlimited reports. So you can keep working on fixing the leaks, putting controls in place, keep generating reports till you get to a state where you are fully compliant. And then, of course, if it's an enterprise customer and then you have custom deals, custom requirements, you want to do this on numerous applications. And this is not just for compliance. ShiftLeft also does technical vulnerability analysis. So we go beyond just looking at sensitive data leaks. We also do OWASP top 10, SANS top 25 kind of vulnerability analysis, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, directory traversal. So we do all of those as well. So when you go for like an enterprise deal, you get all those capabilities too. And then you also expand the supported languages. So to include languages like Go and Objective-C and Python and JavaScript, all of those languages can also be analyzed. So the link, I believe it's also in the chat window where you can go sign up for this option. We are offering it till tomorrow. I believe we can extend it for a week more because it's already just less than 80 days for CCPA. So the fact that organizations, in our experience, require quite some time to go over this, do these analysis, get the results, and fix it. So it's better for you to sign up as early as possible. And I believe in the handout section, we've also put in a sample report of the PDF that I showed screenshots of. So you can take a look at how it would look like. So that gives us 15 minutes. Mitch, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yes, we do. We definitely do. Thank you, Arun. First question is, does this kind of analysis work with HTTPS? In other words, encrypted traffic in addition to unencrypted HTTP?
Yes, it definitely does. The main reason we don't care as to whether your traffic is HTTP or HTTPS is the fact that we work in the development cycle, right? So as I mentioned in one of my previous slides, we don't work in production, we are working in development. So we are working off your actual application binary and source code. So we really don't care how and where you deploy your applications. It could be on-prem, cloud, virtual, whatever. What we care about is what the application actually does. So yes, so we can detect all these traffic and all the data leaks and analysis, irrespective of where and how your application is deployed.
Very good, very helpful. We have a couple of questions, and I might kind of combine them into one. There's a questions about if your company has information, for example, of its own employees, who I assume would be California employees, or maybe just accounts that people are located in residents of California, but all you have is maybe it's user ID and a password. Where is that sort of cutoff where you don't have to do it for these kinds of things, but you do at this when you have this kind of information?
Got it. Okay. So one caveat I mentioned in the beginning. So we are not legal experts; we are technology experts. This session and this tool is not a replacement for having to go through a compliance audit and having to involve a legal team, right? Whereas what we do best is to identify all the types of data that you have, where is it leaking to. So what we don't do is to kind of say that, okay, this data is safe, this data is not, because that then is very company focused, business focused. And so that is where your intelligence and your inputs as a expert in your business would come in. So what we do enable is the ability to modify and influence our analysis. So by that I mean is if we were to identify that this information is sensitive, but you knowing what your business and knowing what your application does, you can influence our algorithm saying, okay, this is not sensitive in my criteria. I don't need to worry about this aspect. Or you could say, I have a way of a control in place. Then you could indicate as to what that control is. So then we would involve that in our analysis and then influence the results. That capability is present, and that's how our current customers use our solution.
Great, very good. If another question that we have is, if a team releases software, say daily, how quickly can you detect new types of leakages?
Within minutes. Right? So the fact I mentioned earlier on that we can analyze up to 1 million lines of code in less than 15 minutes. Most, if not all of our customers today integrate us into the CI/CD pipeline. So by that, whenever there is a new code change happening, which is committed to the source code base, we get invoked. The analysis is run on those changes. In fact, the whole application. And we identify anything new that has been introduced, and we report on it immediately. So you go from making the modification and committing it to seeing results in minutes. And hence it is very easy to adopt and very easy to integrate into any existing tooling that you might have.
Wonderful. That sounds great, Arun. You mentioned also that you integrate at the CI/CD pipeline step. Are there certain languages that you support? How does that work for different technologies?
Yes. So in the list on the previous screen, I mentioned the free assessment we are offering for Java. We support a bunch of languages. Our roadmap has many more coming out soon. So Java, .NET, Scala, Python, JavaScript, Golang, Objective-C, all of these we support, and a bunch more like Swift are on the pipeline. Yes, and the programming language does matter because, as I mentioned, we work off the application and off what the application does. So yeah, so those are languages we support.
Okay, very good. In the case of an ISV, or let's say even a SaaS application, who has the responsibility? The company using and hosting the application, or the ISV who wrote it but isn't running or hosting the app?
Okay, so it's again bordering a bit on the legal aspect. I'll give you my understanding. Again, please don't take this as legal advice. But my understanding of reading this is if I'm using a solution and if I'm the one who is managing or processing customer data, a solution that I utilize not being compliant means I'm not compliant either, because at the end of the day, I am responsible for the customer data I hold. So that's the reason I was mentioning when you use third-party SaaS vendors, APIs, you're using third-party libraries, etc. in your application. Those not being compliant doesn't take the responsibility away from you. At the end of the day, your application is managing data, so you need to be compliant.
Okay, very good. Is there a standard checklist that might be available for compliance, or are there other recommended tools? Of course, we're talking about ShiftLeft today, but possibly other tools that might complement it, or open source software?
For the CCPA compliance checklist, the CCPA Act is pretty broad, right? So there is a lot of processes involved. There's a lot of things that you need to do outside of your technology web applications aspects. So that is that. There's a lot of legal organizations who provide consulting to get you through those steps. For the web applications in specific is where someone like ShiftLeft would come in. And there, the reporting that we've created them based off of what we have read and understood the CCPA Act. So the three steps that we do in the reporting: identifying the data, identifying where it is flowing to, and then helping you figure out the gaps in security. And then if you put a control in place, showing that those controls actually work. Right? So that covers the technology aspects of the CCPA Act for web applications. Now, for a checklist of what to do for CCPA, as I mentioned, CCPA is broad and covers beyond applications. So unfortunately, no, we don't do it. We are not legal experts. But during my analysis and my research for this webinar and for creating these capabilities in our product, I've seen a bunch of those checklists from legal firms and other consulting firms. So they do exist, and those would be good avenues to look for them.
Okay, very good. Great recommendation. Next question is, how is ShiftLeft product analysis different than standard code metric tools, which does code metric cyclomatic complexity analysis?
Yes. So those are code metrics, and they're looking at analytics of your source code. What we do goes into identifying vulnerabilities in your source code. So by that I mean is it's not a performance tool. It is not trying to make your application run better. It is a solution to figure out and find security vulnerabilities in your application. So I mentioned SQL injection, cross-site scripting, directory traversal, path traversal. So all of these are gaps in your application which attackers could use to exploit and take over your application. They could then steal information. They could influence how the application works for nefarious reasons. That is what I mean by identifying technical vulnerabilities. But one thing that we do beyond that, and that's why we are doing this webinar for CCPA, is we also identify sensitive data leaks, data flows, and also the controls that you put. So we go beyond just technical analysis, what all SaaS vendors claim to. We can also do sensitive data leak analysis.
Okay, great. Kind of back to the implementation, the scanning part of this. What if my variable names aren't detected by the semantics, the natural language processing?
Yeah, so good question. So that goes to touch one point I mentioned. We give you access to the dictionary, to the logic that we use to find these variables in your source code. So the dictionary that we use for our natural language processing is made available to end customers to modify and edit. So you can add in your own constructs. If any of our existing constructs doesn't work for you, if it's resulting in false positives, you could modify and edit them so that you can make our tool work the way that you want it. It is very flexible. You can even add additional policies even for sensitive leaks and even for vulnerabilities. So you could say, okay, this is a new type of data destination I have. If data is flowing from point A to point B, I want that to be classified as a leak or classified as a different vulnerability. You can do all those modifications and edits in our algorithm. So customers have that ability.
Okay, very good. Another implementation question. Is there anything you have to modify in your code? I assume this means application code for ShiftLeft to work. You got excluding integrating it into the CI/CD pipeline. Are there any code modifications required?
Absolutely not. So you can use the source code as it is today. We don't need to do any additions. There are specific ways where I've seen, like the financial institution that I mentioned in the previous slide who gave us the code. What they do in their source base for Java, they already use their own annotations for them to track data. We can even use those annotations that already exist in the source code, but we don't require you to add any specific annotations, any changes in your source code. We work off the source code and binary, so you don't even need to change how you build your application. We work off the output of your build for languages like Java. The integration into a CI/CD pipeline is very straightforward. It's literally as simple as adding one command into your pipeline. We literally do it over a phone call with most of our customers, so they get it done in like 15-20 minutes. So it's very easy to integrate, very easy to use, and no need to change anything in your source code.
Great, that's wonderful to hear. Well, we're coming up near the close of our time. I have one more question, if you can answer it briefly. You mentioned that other static code analysis tools need access to all code bases to analyze, but doesn't this tool also need access to all code bases as well? It will only analyze the code feed into the tool, correct?
That's correct, yes. So yes, we do require, if it is languages like C# and JavaScript, etc., yes, we require access to the source base. For a language like Java, we don't even need access to source base. We could work off the jar file, which is the output of the build system. So we don't need access to the source base in that language. But one main difference with other SaaS vendors is we work also across all your dependencies. So think of like a software composition analysis working across your entire stack. We can do that given how fast and efficient we are. So we work beyond just your custom code.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Arun, and thank you for your excellent questions from the audience and, of course, your responses as well, Arun. Also want to offer just my own congratulations on the Data Leakage Protection Solution of the Year award. That's fantastic. Congrats to ShiftLeft. Also want to remind our audience that we are providing a recording of the webinar. Today's webinar will be available via an email link and also available on the devops.com website. So we'd like to get to our gift cards. We have 3 Amazon gift cards, and our winners are Kevin D, William M, John T. So we'll be reaching out to you with how to get a hold of those cards. So I'd like to thank Arun for being our speaker today. Arun Balakrishnan is Director of Product Management at ShiftLeft, and of course, thank our sponsor, ShiftLeft. I'd also like to thank you, our audience, for spending your valuable time from us this afternoon, this morning, wherever you are in the world. It's been my pleasure to host today's webinar. Thank you and have a great day. Be careful out there.